Okay, get ready to dive into some serious brain food with us today. We're tackling Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, a book that, frankly, can feel a bit intimidating even for seasoned bookworms.
It's true. The Second Sex is a dense read, but that's why we're here. We'll unpack its powerful ideas in a way that's clear, engaging, and helps you grasp why this book is still making waves decades later.
Exactly. Think of us as your guides through this influential work, and don't worry, you don't need a PhD in feminist theory to get a lot out of this deep dive.
What's so captivating about Beauvoir is that she wasn't just theorizing in isolation. Imagine 1940s Paris, a hotbed of intellectual thought, and there's Beauvoir, exchanging ideas with giants like anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss as she's forming the ideas that would become the second sex.
She was tapping into something much larger than herself, trying to answer that age-old question. What does it mean to be a woman?
And she drops this bombshell of an idea right at the start, one that's become a cornerstone of feminism, woman as other.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and trust me, this is a concept that'll make you see the world differently. Beauvoir argues that throughout history, man has been considered the one, the standard, the default setting for humanity. Woman, on the other hand, is only defined in relation to him.
She's not seen as a complete being in her own right, but rather the other defined by her difference from men, not by her own unique qualities or potential. Have you ever felt like you were being defined by your gender rather than who you are as a person? That's this otherness that Beauvoir is talking about.
It's such a powerful way of framing it, and to really drive her point home, Beauvoir digs into examples from ancient myths and literature, social customs, even legal systems, to show just how deeply ingrained this idea of otherness really is.
She talks about how, in early societies, women were both feared and revered for their connection to nature and childbirth. They were seen as these powerful goddesses, fertility figures, but still ultimately controlled by men.
And then there's ancient Greece, birthplace of democracy and philosophy, yet even those great thinkers, with a few exceptions like Plato, really seem to have it out for women.
It's true. They reinforce this notion of women belonging solely in the domestic sphere, subservient to men. Beauvoir even quotes the Athenian statesman Pericles, who said, and this is a quote that's always stuck with me, "The best woman is she of whom men speak the least."
Wow. It's amazing how those attitudes from thousands of years ago can still feel so relevant, even today.
It's because these ideas are so deeply embedded in our culture. And it's not just ancient history. Beauvoir brings up the French Revolution, a time of massive social upheaval when the cry was liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, brotherhood. But even then, women were largely excluded from the conversation.
They were fighting for freedom and equality, but it was like their voices just weren't being heard.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Beauvoir recounts the tragic story of Olympe de Gouges. This remarkable woman dared to write a declaration of the rights of woman, demanding the same rights and freedoms granted to men. And what happened?
She was sent to the guillotine for her audacity. It's heartbreaking, but it really highlights the point that, for much of history, women were essentially treated as property.
That's one of Beauvoir's most radical claims. The oppression of women is intrinsically tied to the concept of ownership. First, a woman is her father's property, then she becomes her husband's.
So it's not just about men being in charge, it's about this deeply ingrained belief that women are possessions to be controlled.
Exactly. And Beauvoir shows how this plays out in disturbing ways, from the infanticide of female babies literally seen as less valuable, to the intense focus on a woman's virginity as a measure of her worth.
It's like a woman's value was directly tied to her purity, which is really just another way of controlling her sexuality, isn't it?
Precisely. And the hypocrisy is even more evident when you look at the double standard around adultery. For a woman, it was a grave offense, potentially costing her inheritance or even her life. But for a man, it was often brushed aside.
It's shocking that even the Napoleonic Code, which was supposed to modernize and bring fairness to the legal system, had provisions allowing leniency for men who murdered their wives for infidelity.
It wasn't until very recently that these laws were finally changed, which just goes to show how deeply ingrained these double standards really are. And it affects women in every aspect of their lives, from the personal to the professional.
Even during the Industrial Revolution, when women started entering the workforce in larger numbers, it wasn't exactly a story of liberation, was it?
Not quite. While it gave women some economic power, their labor was often exploited. They were seen as more docile and less likely to unionize than men, so they were paid less and subjected to terrible working conditions.
So much for progress, right? It seems like no matter what the historical context, women were stuck in this impossible position. But Beauvoir doesn't stop there. She dives even deeper into the personal realm, exploring how these societal expectations play out in love and relationships.
And this is where things get really fascinating. She argues that men often hold these contradictory desires when it comes to women. They want both a servant and a sorceress.
Hmm.
They want a woman who is both subservient and mysterious, docile yet alluring.
So which is it? Are they supposed to be the perfect housewife or some unattainable femme fatale? It seems like a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. And Beauvoir unpacks this dynamic brilliantly through literary examples. She talks about Desdemona from Shakespeare's Othello, a woman unjustly suspected and murdered out of her husband's jealousy.
And there's also the tale of patient Griselda from Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, who endures unimaginable trials of loyalty and obedience to her husband.
These stories might seem like ancient history, but they highlight a pattern that continues to this day. Women punished for defying male expectations, often in the name of love.
It's a no-win situation. Women are expected to be both desirable objects and uphold impossibly high moral standards.
Which, as you can imagine, creates this incredible sense of hypocrisy and self-loathing. It's a theme that Beauvoir returns to again and again throughout the book.
It's almost like women are trapped in this constant performance, never allowed to be their full, authentic selves. And it's not just in literature or historical examples. One of the things that makes The Second Sex so relatable is how brilliantly Beauvoir breaks down the experience of being a teenage girl.
Yeah, this is where I think for a lot of readers, her insights feel incredibly modern and poignant.
Yeah.
She really nails that feeling of navigating adolescence as a girl.
Totally.
The expectations, the confusions, the anxieties that come with suddenly being viewed through a very different lens.
Right. She talks about how girls are expected to go from this relatively free and independent existence as children to suddenly being valued primarily for their appearance and their potential as wives and mothers.
You're exactly.
It's a jarring transition.
Absolutely. And she really dives into the physical changes of puberty, the onset of menstruation experiences that can be confusing, even frightening for young girls. She doesn't shy away from the realities of growing up female in a culture that often sexualizes and objectifies women.
And then there's that really striking section about the appendix operation desire. Beauvoir talks about girls wishing they could surgically remove the source of their perceived vulnerability. I mean, how powerful is that image?
It's incredibly powerful. It speaks to this deep-seated feeling of being ill at ease in one's own body, of wanting to erase the very thing that marks you as female in a society that doesn't always value femininity on its own terms.
It's almost like, on some level, these girls recognize that their bodies are being seen as something to be controlled, even feared. It really makes you think about how those early experiences can shape a woman's self-perception for years to come.
Exactly. And that brings us to Beauvoir's critique of marriage, which she saw as a prime example of how these societal forces play out in women's lives. Now, it's important to note that Beauvoir isn't condemning marriage outright.
Right. She's not saying all marriage is bad or that love is impossible.
Exactly. Her point is that traditional marriage, the kind that was dominant in her time and, frankly, still holds sway today, often becomes a trap that reinforces women's secondary status.
And she really doesn't hold back in her descriptions of what that trap looks like, does she?
Not at all. One of my favorite parts of the book is where she compares housework, the endless cooking, cleaning, and caretaking expected of wives, to the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to eternally push a boulder uphill, only to have it roll back down.
That's such a perfect analogy. It captures the drudgery, the repetition, the feeling that you're never really finished, that your work is never truly done.
And more importantly, I think, that this labor is often invisible and undervalued. Society might celebrate the image of the perfect housewife, but it rarely acknowledges the sheer amount of work that goes into maintaining that image.
And she has that really poignant story about Mrs. G, an impoverished American mother who's struggling to make ends meet. Despite living in poverty, in a house infested with cockroaches, she's constantly trying to make it pretty, to create some semblance of order and beauty.
But it's a losing battle. She's constantly overwhelmed by the demands of her domestic life, by the lack of resources, and eventually breaks down in tears, realizing that she can't escape the squalor no matter how hard she tries.
It's heartbreaking, but it also reveals this deeper truth about how women are often expected to create beauty and order out of chaos, to shoulder the emotional and physical burdens of the home with little recognition or reward.
And that expectation can be incredibly stifling, especially for women who have dreams and aspirations beyond the domestic sphere.
Beauvoir contrasts Mrs. G's experience with that of Madame de Charrière, a woman who initially embraces the idea of marriage, but soon finds herself suffocated by its limitations.
Right. Madame de Charrière represents this yearning for something more, that desire to break free from the confines of domesticity and pursue her own intellectual and creative passions. She symbolizes the countless women throughout history who've struggled to reconcile their ambitions with societal expectations.
So where does that leave us? If marriage is a trap and society constantly reinforces women's secondary status, how can they possibly find freedom in a world designed by and for men?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And to be honest, Beauvoir doesn't offer any easy answers. She recognizes that there's no magic solution, no single path to liberation. But she does offer some glimmers of hope, some suggestions for how women can begin to carve out their own paths to fulfillment.
Okay, let's dig into that. What does she propose?
One of her central arguments is that true liberation begins with economic independence. As long as women are financially dependent on men, their freedom will always be limited.
That makes perfect sense. It's hard to imagine having true agency in your own life if you don't have control over your own finances.
Exactly. And she also stresses the importance of women pursuing meaningful work outside the home work that allows them to use their talents, to contribute to society, and to gain a sense of purpose and fulfillment, independent of their roles as wives and mothers.
And she backs this up with some pretty inspiring examples of women throughout history who defied expectations and found fulfillment in their careers, right?
Exactly. She points to figures like Isabella of Spain, a powerful ruler who defied the conventions of her time, and Queen Elizabeth I of England, who famously declared, "I have the heart and stomach of a king."
And it's not just about women in positions of political power. Beauvoir also celebrates the accomplishments of female artists, writers, and thinkers. Women like Marie Curie, who revolutionized our understanding of radioactivity, or Virginia Woolf, who pushed the boundaries of literature with her stream of consciousness style. These women, they weren't just successful in a man's world, they redefined what success could look like on their own terms. But even with these inspiring examples, I can't help but think about how much Beauvoir's book still resonates today, decades after it was written. I mean, we've made progress, sure, but haven't these ideas about women and their place in society proven to be really, really stubborn?
It's true. The Second Sex wasn't just a book for its time. It was a searing indictment of a deeply ingrained system that has persisted for centuries. And that's why Beauvoir's work remains so relevant. She wasn't just offering solutions. She was diagnosing a fundamental problem in Western civilization, the problem of women's otherness.
And that otherness goes way beyond just like differences between men and women, right?
Right.
It's about power. It's about who gets to tell the story, who gets to define what's normal and what's not.
Exactly. And one of the ways this power dynamic plays out is through something Beauvoir calls the male gaze. It's this idea that women have been conditioned to see themselves through the eyes of men, to constantly judge their worth based on whether or not they're meeting male standards of beauty, desirability, or acceptability.
Oh, I totally get that. It's like we're always looking in a mirror, but the reflection we see is distorted by centuries of patriarchy telling us what we're supposed to look like, how we're supposed to behave.
Precisely. And the insidious thing about the male gaze is that it can become so internalized that women start to police themselves and each other, reinforcing these very standards that limit their freedom and potential.
It's almost like we become complicit in our own oppression without even realizing it.
And that's a really powerful insight that Beauvoir offers, I think. She doesn't just point fingers at men or blame them for all of society's ills. She recognizes that women also play a role in upholding these harmful systems, often out of a desire to survive or to succeed within them.
It's that old saying, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. But Beauvoir seems to be saying, hey, maybe there's another way. Maybe we can challenge these rules, these assumptions that have been holding us back for so long.
Exactly. And that's what makes her work so empowering. She's not just diagnosing the problem. She's urging women to wake up, to become aware of these forces that are shaping their lives, and to fight back against them.
So how do we do that? Where do we even begin to dismantle these deeply ingrained systems of oppression?
Well, Beauvoir believed that it starts with awareness, recognizing these patterns of otherness, of the male gaze, of how patriarchy plays out in our everyday lives. From there, she argues, we can begin to make different choices, to challenge the status quo, to create new narratives for ourselves and for future generations.
And she doesn't pretend that it's going to be easy, does she?
No, not at all. She's very honest about the challenges women face. She talks about the internalized sexism that can make it difficult for women to believe in themselves, to pursue their ambitions, without seeking validation from men.
It's like we've been conditioned to doubt our own abilities, to constantly second guess ourselves, and that can be really hard to break free from.
Absolutely. But Beauvoir reminds us that this internalized sexism is a product of culture, not biology. It's learned, which means it can be unlearned.
So there's hope. We're not just destined to repeat these patterns forever.
There's always hope. Beauvoir believed that true liberation requires a conscious effort to reject those limiting beliefs and to embrace a more expansive vision of what it means to be a woman.
And part of that, I imagine, is recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all definition of womanhood,
Right.
right?
Yep.
It's not about all women becoming CEOs or abandoning motherhood or fitting into some narrow mold.
Precisely. It's about expanding the possibilities, creating a world where women have the freedom to choose their own paths, whether that means pursuing a career, raising a family, or some combination of both.
And crucially, it's about valuing those choices equally, right?
Right. This is
Not making women feel like they have to choose between motherhood and a career, or that their worth is somehow diminished if they prioritize one over the other.
exactly. It's about breaking free from those false dichotomies and creating a society that supports women in whatever paths they choose. And that's not just about individual empowerment. Beauvoir also emphasized the importance of collective action, of women supporting each other in their struggles for equality.
It's about recognizing that we're stronger together, that we can achieve so much more when we work together to dismantle those structures that have kept women down for far too long.
Absolutely. And it's a fight that continues today. The second sex remains such a vital text, even after all these years, because it reminds us that the fight for gender equality is far from over.
It's a call to action, urging us to be vigilant, to keep pushing for change, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
And it reminds us that this fight is not just about achieving equality for women, as important as that is. It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can live a life of freedom, authenticity, and fulfillment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the second sex, what's the one thing you hope our listener will take away from Beauvoir's groundbreaking work?
I think the most important takeaway is that the personal is political. The seemingly small choices we make in our everyday lives, the roles we accept, the expectations we challenge, the way we raise our children, they all contribute to either upholding or dismantling these systems of oppression.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix it. We have to be willing to challenge the status quo, to question those deeply ingrained assumptions about gender that have held us back for far too long.
Beauvoir ends her book with this incredibly provocative question. If, as she has argued, woman has always been defined as the other, the negative image reflected in the mirror of man, what happens when women shatter that mirror?
What happens when we finally reject that limited reflection and define ourselves on our own terms? That's the question Simone de Beauvoir leaves us with. And it's a question worth pondering as we navigate our own lives and strive to create a more just and equitable future for all.
There's always hope. Beauvoir believed that true liberation requires a conscious effort, to reject those limiting beliefs and to embrace a more expansive vision of what it means to be a woman.
And part of that, I imagine, is recognizing that there's not like a one-size-fits-all definition of womanhood, right?
Right.
It's not about all women becoming CEOs or abandoning motherhood or fitting into some narrow mold.
Yeah, precisely. It's about expanding the possibilities, creating a world where women have the freedom to choose their own paths, whether that means pursuing a career, raising a family, or some combination of both.
And crucially, it's about valuing those choices equally, right?
Yeah.
Not making women feel like they have to choose between motherhood and a career, or that their worth is somehow diminished if they prioritize one over the other.
Exactly. It's about breaking free from those false dichotomies and creating a society that supports women and whatever paths they choose. And that's not just about individual empowerment either. Beauvoir also emphasized the importance of collective action, of women supporting each other in their struggles for equality.
It's about recognizing that we're stronger together, that we can achieve so much more when we work together to dismantle those structures that have kept women down for far too long.
Absolutely. And it's a fight that continues today. The second sex remains such a vital text, even after all these years, because it reminds us that the fight for gender equality is far from over.
It's a call to action, urging us to be vigilant, to keep pushing for change, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
And it reminds us that this fight is not just about achieving equality for women, as important as that is. It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can live a life of freedom, authenticity, and fulfillment.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the second sex, what's the one thing you hope our listener will take away from Beauvoir's groundbreaking work?
I think the most important takeaway is that the personal is political. The seemingly small choices we make in our everyday lives, the roles we accept, the expectations we challenge, the way we raise our children, they all contribute to either upholding or dismantling these systems of oppression.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix it. We have to be willing to challenge the status quo, to question those deeply ingrained assumptions about gender that have held us back for far too long.
Beauvoir ends her book with this incredibly provocative question. If, as she has argued, woman has always been defined as the other, the negative image reflected in the mirror of man, what happens when women shatter that mirror?
What happens when we finally reject that limited reflection and define ourselves in our own terms? That is the question Simone de Beauvoir leaves us with. And it's a question worth pondering, I think, as we navigate our own lives and strive to create a more just and equitable future for all. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.